Greetings, one and all. I'd like to open with a quick word of thanks to those of you who have sent in entries for the Sing the POZ Song Challenge. It's been a blast getting these, and I love having the chance to interact with you like this. If any more of you want to make up and sing your own lyrics, please email them or send me a link by Twitter or Facebook. And please, don't be nervous or apologize for what you sent. This isn't a talent competition or anything, just a way to have some fun and interact as a community. Now this week we have an awesome full-length rendition by none other than Bionic Dance, so I'm going to let her carry us through the intro.
Prophet of Zod, his head is static, his voice is not emphatic, but when theists get so erratic, his takedowns are traumatic, logic, reason so pragmatic, video so cinematic, please don't run on automatic, oops that's my line so dramatic, watch his vids you'll be ecstatic, when he burns down God's fanatics, it'll be oh so climactic, okay I'm done now, bye bye, that's it.
Wow, an animation and everything. Thanks, Bionic Dance. If any of you somehow haven't heard of her, she's been a long-time fixture in the atheist YouTube community, so go check her out. A link's in the description box. Other than that, I have a couple announcements about my less-than-weekly upload schedule and Patreon charges, but instead of carrying on about them, I've left them in the description and a pinned comment. So, read them if you want. Also remember to like, comment, subscribe, and select the Receive All Notifications option next to the bell, if you want to be notified whenever a video comes out. It's probably a little more useful now that I'm not swinging videos every week lately. That out of the way, today I'm going to review a conversation I had with a couple theists, who argued that things like math or morality indicate the existence of God, and how in doing so they were ultimately using what I would consider a God of the gaps argument. Now of course nobody wants to think they're using this kind of argument. The phrase God of the gaps is used by atheists, rightly or not depending on the situation, to brush off a theistic argument as fallacious, and even most theists are aware enough of its shortcomings to want to distance themselves from it. The reason for this is pretty clear. In its purest, most transparent form, a God of the gaps argument is doing something we all recognize as silly, which is looking at something we can't currently explain and just saying, God did it. Not only is this a blindingly obvious fallacy, jumping straight to a pre-existing answer that you want to believe in rather than admitting you don't know what you don't know, but it harkens back to the most ancient primitive behavior we stereotypically associate with our ancestors, which is staring in stupefied awe at lightning or fire or the sun and concluding they must be somehow supernatural. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying this is how ancient humanity should be fairly characterized. After all, I did refer to it as a stereotype, and my point is not to delve into the nuance of ancient thinking as much as point out the baggage that comes with a God of the gaps label. In its most extreme forms, at least, it represents the clearest opposite of scientific thinking we can imagine, automatically being mystified by the world and jumping to clear, easy answers about it instead of investigating it. So you can imagine why theists don't want to be associated with these arguments, why they chafe at being accused of using them and want to be clear that theirs are not God of the gaps arguments. But regardless of how badly apologists want to distance themselves from the label, or project some version of it onto others, as inspiring philosophy did with his I know you are but what am I strategy of saying atheists just use science of the gaps arguments, I would contend that almost all apologetics fall back to some form of God of the gaps, and that they do so in a way that's very clearly distinct from any form of scientific thinking. This was neatly illustrated in the conversation I'm going to allude to. I'm sure you're all familiar with some form of arguments like these, which I think are basically transcendental arguments for God, but the idea was that things like math or morality can't just be human constructs. Because while we build an understanding of them in our minds, whatever we come up with refers to and must align with something outside ourselves. In math, 1 + 1 = 2 is an objective truth regardless of what humans think. And when it comes to morality, kindness is a universal good and murder a universal bad, not because we've decided so, but because that's just how it is. These are truths about the universe we have to discover, not arbitrary concepts we can make up answers to. We can't just decide that 1 + 1 = 3, and we can't just decide that kindness is bad and murder is good. In short, these principles were decided by the universe, or as one person put it, we don't decide what's good or bad, the universe does. This implies that there's some form of larger consciousness out there that defines the nature of math and morality, and by definition that consciousness must be what we call God. Of course, we all know, and I can just about hear you screaming at your screens, that this is anthropomorphizing the universe in a way that pollutes the conversation from the start. But what got these people here? What made them formulate these kinds of arguments, and why do they find them compelling? I personally think there's a very simple illusion at work here. And to illustrate, let's say a guy named Joe, having always lived alone on a desert island, comes to the conclusion that 1 + 1 = 2. When he does this, he's noticing a pattern. He sees a single coconut, and he uses the word 1 to quantitatively describe it. From there, he notices that if you place another coconut next to it, it can be useful for various reasons to conceptualize them as a group. And he uses the word 2 to describe the grouping. To sum up this reality, he draws the symbols 1 + 1 = 2 in the sand, which indicates the predictability of the fact that every time you take a single coconut and group it with another single coconut, you always have what you call 2 coconuts, and that the separate entities and the pairing are and always will be equal to each other. Now yes, this is really belaboring the obvious, but when asking ourselves, is math a human construct, as one of the theists asked me, because, if it's not a purely human construct, it must have come from the mind of a god, it's important to be very clear about what happened inside Joe's mind versus outside of it. All he observed was a material reality. Namely, he saw one object and he saw another. It's important to recognize that that's literally all that happened outside his mind. Everything else in the situation, the way he categorized something as a single item, the way he grouped multiple items and gave them the labels 1 when apart and 2 when together, the symbols in the structure of the sentence 1 + 1 = 2, it all existed purely in his thoughts. That's where all the elegant conceptualization behind math exists. Now, it's possible for Joe to get the impression that the math he did actually exists somewhere out in the universe. But this is a hazy concept at best, and if Joe thinks this, he's likely confusing two things. One, the language and conceptual ability that allowed him to construct a mathematical model, and two, the purely physical reality he was observing. This can make it easy for him to get the impression of intent behind, or even a mind out there in, the universe. But this is just projecting our mental frameworks onto physical reality, which tricks us into falling for an old evolutionary instinct to see agency where it doesn't exist. See, when you observe the universe, all you're looking at are objects or other material facts. Of course, when you start thinking about them, you create a representation of them in your mind. From there, you use abstract thoughts to label, categorize, make connections between, and in all other ways analyze these abstract versions of what you see. But here's the tricky question. Where in this process does the representation of the object end and your abstract analysis of it begin? Without a lot of introspection, the line between the two can blur in your mind, and thus it can be easy to get the two entwined. So when you recognize the object as something out there, you can get the feeling that some of your own abstract thoughts are out there with it, thus giving you the feeling that something as apparently ethereal as the thoughts you feel swirling around in your head are out in the universe. I think this is what causes a theist to see God when looking out there. Morality has a similar pair of components as math. The only external reality it addresses is a body of facts about how people interact with each other and what comes about as a result. It's inside our heads that we conceptualize the need to balance our desire for immediate gratification with our own long-term good and the good of other people, as well as the complex frameworks needed to do this on a large scale. And in this case, more than with math, strong emotions are added to the internal component. We care what happens to ourselves over the long run, and because of our species' strong sense of empathy, we generally care what happens to other people. Thus we work to create the best long-term outcome we can, where society is stable and people are treated well. It can feel very much like there's an external law to this, because, as with math, we can accidentally overlap our observation of what's happening outside our heads with how we're processing on the inside, thus tricking ourselves into thinking that the moral concepts in our minds exist out there somewhere. To the point of thinking that our abstract, internalized concept of morality is some actual spiritual web that connects everything, is bigger than us, and must be some version of our thoughts that comes from outside us, maybe even outside the universe. Of course, with morality, we're left with a nagging question of why it seems so universal. I mean, how did we get such similar values across cultures unless a God imparted them to us, right? Well, I guess God is one possible explanation. But, hear me out, Maybe it's as simple as the fact that there are basic values that any culture would need to survive. Just think about what would happen if there had ever been a culture that lacked the instinct to do things like care for its young or empathize with others, or never developed a general prohibition against theft and murder. It almost certainly would have destroyed itself by now, right? This is because the body of social skills behind what we call universal moral values are so fundamentally necessary for survival that while we can invoke God to explain them, doing so is totally unnecessary. Cross-cultural morality is about as surprising as the fact that people across cultures have learned to build shelter and don't enjoy starving to death. But the more fundamental problem is that, when it comes down to it, we are essentially looking at God of the gaps arguments. Taking what I consider the more compelling of the two arguments, the morality one, let's imagine a moral value that had no social advantage and didn't seem to be rooted in any intelligible instinct. I'll use an example given by a friend, which is a universal taboo against showing your eyes one day a week that leads everybody around the world to put on blindfolds for that day. This is indeed a bizarre rule, and we might have trouble understanding why it exists across cultures. But should we infer God's existence from it? No. The mysterious existence of this taboo would prove only one thing, that the taboo exists and is currently a mystery to us. To infer God from this is to claim that you're aware of all possible explanations for the phenomenon and have eliminated all of them except for God. You know, that classic but horrible, eliminate the impossible and whatever's left, no matter how improbable, must be the truth nonsense, which is basically just a logical fallacy dressed in fancy language. But there are endless other possibilities. Maybe the taboo somehow, against long odds, had managed to get communicated across the prehistoric world. Maybe it's just a weird one-off instinct. Maybe we all share a telepathic link. Maybe aliens or time travelers taught it to us. Yes, these are weird possibilities, and they may sound weirder than God. But that's only because God is a more familiar explanation. A larger disembodied mind did it is at least as far-fetched as the others once you step back and look at it for what it is. Thus we can see that God is just being inserted as a flat guess into this supposed gap in our knowledge. And isn't that kind of God of the gaps by definition? Yet appeals to math or morality, or other transcendent arguments, will remain effective because we'll always remain mystified by our own thinking. On some level, our thoughts feel ethereal, almost spiritual, as they swim around in our heads. It's easy to take them as something more than they are, and regardless of how thoroughly we scan the human brain and map the technicalities of where these thoughts come from, we won't fully overcome that feeling. Operating from within them, we'll always feel surrounded by them, unable to isolate them and fully study their parts without our active observation being impacted by them. And theists are trained to see part of their own ego as God, so when they project their thinking out into the universe, they see God out there. That's why I think our minds will remain the last refuge of apologetics, no matter what else we learn about the universe. And more broadly speaking, I think this illustrates the fact that if you peel back the layers of almost any apologetic, you'll eventually find some kind of implicit God of the gaps argument at the core. Yes, modern apologetics are more elaborate and I guess sophisticated than jumping around hollering in amazement at the sight of lightning. But the reasoning is literally the same. Think about it. A first cause argument is nothing more than an explanation for why there's currently a gap in our understanding of the universe's origins, followed by the claim that only God can fill it. Creationist attempts at debunking evolution are merely an attempt to create a gap in our understanding of where life as we see it came from, so that they can then claim that only God can fill it. And there's a simple reason apologetics will always follow this pattern, which is that theists can't show us God. All they can do is show us supposedly unexplained phenomena and claim God must be the default explanation. Of course, it could be countered that God's just too vast and/or immaterial to fully observe, so all we can see are limited signs from which to infer his existence. And it could be further argued that we do the same with other large, hard-to-detect phenomena. But as I explained in my You Can't See the Wind, Dumb Things video, when we deal intelligently with such phenomena, all we do is describe the parts of them we can detect. We might make tentative inferences about what lies beyond the detectable, but we test them and keep our inferences tentative by degree, depending on how thoroughly we've managed to test them. Apologetics, however, takes a big and vital step beyond this, and this is a core concept we need to keep at the forefront of our minds and possibly conversation, as apologists try to dazzle us with elaborate arguments from which they claim to infer God is the most likely explanation for things. All they can point us to are specific aspects of the universe that we might currently find mysterious, and rather than taking a parsimonious approach to observing them, probing their boundaries, and coming to a better understanding of what they are, they simply dump buckets of guessed-at information in the form of their description of God into them. And as in the example of morality, there are countless other possible explanations for all of them, and the fact that God's their favorite does nothing to change that. So while it doesn't feel as obviously silly as looking at the lightning and thinking, wow, that must be the gods, the thought process is, at its core, essentially the same. It's a non-parsimonious act that violates Occam's razor and runs so far contrary to disciplined scientific observation that it deserves to be immediately dismissed as anything but guessing. Now, are these all technically God of the gaps arguments? Well, I've heard people define the word in different ways, and I guess I'm not all that interested in what technically falls under the label. However, I think it's safe to say that most arguments for God at least fall back to the same fundamental underlying error. Call it God of the gaps or don't. But let's still see it for what it is and treat it for the fallacy it is. This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, Nem Morris, Connor Emsley, Susan Schindler-Loreto, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.